It's no secret that Apple's been struggling a lot in the AI era. Apple Intelligence just kind of hasn't happened, and the quality of experience with Siri is so bad, it's honestly kind of laughable. I can't remember the last time I asked it to do anything more complicated than setting an alarm, and I'm one of those guys that actually uses AI quite a bit. So, with all that said, how do they fix it? Where does Apple come back when they're this far behind? Especially when competitors like Microsoft, OpenAI, and Google are leaping so far ahead. They spend their money. That's how they solve this. Apple has so much money that they're sitting on that they are able to spend it to solve these types of problems. And despite spending a ton on training models internally, they just haven't gotten the quality that they need to be competitive, which is why they're partnering with Google for a $1 billion custom model. This is absurd as is, but as you look into the details, it gets crazier. Like the fact that that $1 billion number isn't an arbitrarily chosen super high price tag. It's actually being chosen because this is the cheaper option. Apple's going with Google because the other options they explored would have been more expensive than just paying Google for a custom, I would assume is Gemini 3 based model for them to use for Siri. It's a giant model, 1.2 trillion parameters, and it seems like Apple's not buying their infrastructure. They're just buying the model itself. But unlike Apple, I don't have $1 billion to spend on a custom model, so let's do a quick word from today's sponsor. AI models are smart, but they get way smarter when you give them the ability to run code. But where are you going to run that code? You can't just execute randomly generated code on your existing box. You can set up a sandbox, but good luck keeping it safe. You really need purpose-built infrastructure to do this right. And that's where Daytona comes in. These guys really get infra and the needs of your AI agents when you're writing code to do tasks on demand. On one hand, they're a serverless platform, but on the other, they're a full environment with everything you need. It's actually stateful, which you don't really expect from things like this, but it's so convenient to have the ability to write a file and have it stay there. It's really good, especially when you consider that you're only built for the CPU invocations that you're actually doing. It's still wild to see this SDK because it's just like a remote box via JavaScript or Python, of course, for those who prefer it. You can just execute code directly. You literally just pass a TypeScript and it will run it safely. Their agent toolbox is full of all the things you'll need for these systems, from the file system directly to Git operations and an actual LSP built in. Oh, so useful. If you're trying to build your own vibe coding platform, Daytona is going to be a great place to start. They are literally 5 cents per hour of compute used. And that's the compute that your code is actually running, not when it's waiting for your agent to go finish the next LLM prompt. So good. Before I forget, they'll give you $200 of compute if you sign up now at soydev.link/Daytona. Okay, let's dive into this one. Apple nears $1 billion Google deal for custom Gemini model to power Siri. This model is 1.2 trillion parameters, costs $1 billion, originally reported by Mark Gurman, who's very good at having Apple leaks and early Apple news. So this is very likely real information. When you remember that Apple's been trying to form partnerships with Anthropic, OpenAI, and now Google, this gets crazy. But where, in my opinion, it gets even crazier is how Apple's positioned in the market. I'm old enough that I remember the days where Apple's number one competitor was Microsoft. And then that shifted over to Google, largely because of Android, if I'm being real. That said, Android makes Google less money than iOS does, so it's a weird balancing situation for them as well, especially when you consider the fact that Google pays a ton of money for Google to be the default search on iPhones. There's a lot of weird money back and forth between Google and Apple. Google's paying Apple $18 billion plus a year to be the default search on iOS. So this is Apple giving up a 20th of that to potentially have a horse in the race for AI again. But $1 billion is a lot of money. Can't they spend that to train something better internally? They've been trying, and internally, the biggest model they have is 150 billion parameters. To be clear, parameter measurements are not the only way to know how good a model is or isn't, but we're talking about an order of magnitude difference here between what Google has to offer and what Apple has. And when you realize what Apple's biggest weakness is here, it makes a lot more sense. Apple doesn't have the data they need to train a model. We can come up with conspiracy theories all day about why Apple's struggling so much. One of my favorites is a paper that they published about the illusion of thinking. Apple funded research that helped try and prove that LLMs aren't actually thinking during their reasoning stages, which is interesting because reasoning without question increases the quality of outputs for most models in most scenarios. But they wrote their own research combating the role of the thinking in these models. It was a very interesting piece of research. And it shows that they are thinking a lot about this stuff, but maybe not in the ways they need to. But there's a much bigger issue that they have. Apple doesn't have data. I've seen a lot of posts that are like, which company do you trust more with your data, Apple or Google? And just this type of weird rage baity bullshit on Twitter. If you legitimately believe Google or Microsoft are better with your data than Apple, then you fundamentally don't understand their business models. Apple doesn't make money from your data. They make money selling you hardware and subscriptions to their services. Google makes money off of ad data. Microsoft needs data for almost everything that they're doing. Apple's the one company that doesn't really have a big financial incentive to collect your data, which is why they not only haven't done that, they've actually went out of their way to help their users be on more private encrypted devices and keep their data from leaking. The worst thing that ever happened to Meta was when Apple pushed a change to iOS that made it harder to track people between different apps. Because now it's impossible for Facebook to know what you're doing in apps like Amazon or other things that they're partnering with. The Facebook tracking pixel was a big deal back in the day where you'd embed like one little JavaScript file in your websites and you'd get the fancy Facebook like button, all these other things people want on their sites, but that would give Facebook access to tracking a user across different services. So they could go from one website to another, and if any of them had the Facebook like button, they'd be able to link it back to you and your session and learn a ton about you. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and more have collected so much data over the years that they have a lot of what they need to train these models. So let's think about all the companies that have better models than Apple does. Microsoft does, even though like the Azure models aren't great, they are definitely better than what Apple's been cooking. Obviously, Google is crushing them. Even Meta is arguably crushing them with the Llama series, even though Llama hasn't progressed meaningfully in a while. Speaking of which, where are those bigger versions of Llama 4? Remember when we were promised those like almost a year ago now? The Llama stuff at Meta is chaos, so we won't think about that too much. Regardless, they had the data to make those in the first place. And then, of course, the big two, Anthropic and OpenAI. So obviously, we get how these companies at the top here got their data. They had a business incentive to have data, so they did. And now they have everything they need to train, other than researchers, GPUs, money, all things they can make up for. But what about these two? How did Anthropic and OpenAI manage to do this? This is a controversial take, but I think it's pretty obvious. The way Anthropic and OpenAI were able to train is by scraping data from every source they could find. And the result of that was that they got a good amount of data to do this training. But now as a result, most of these services have locked down your ability to get data out of them. Websites like Twitter and Reddit have fully locked down their APIs, so you can't scrape them the way you could before. It used to be relatively trivial to just watch the fire hose from Twitter and get all of the data that they're having posted on their site, or to have a bunch of APIs crawling Reddit, just collecting endless data. I'd go as far as to say Anthropic and OpenAI's scraping of these services has resulted in me using Reddit way less, because when the Reddit API got restricted, the Reddit apps I used got destroyed as a side effect of that. And Reddit's desire to sell this data instead of giving it away took out all of these services I cared about in the crossfire. And that sucks. But now it's not really viable for other companies to have the giant pile of data that Anthropic and OpenAI collected, and all of these other companies got their own separate ways by mostly tracking their users. So all of these companies, for reasons I think make obvious sense, have a shitload of data that is useful for training models. And I also think it's obvious that Apple doesn't because of the way they think about and manage data. Historically, Apple doesn't track these things or care to hold these things. They don't have a whole lot of data, which has been great until now. Historically, these models were trained on these large corpuses of labeled data in order to try and make next token prediction more reliable. Now the data these models are being trained on isn't just getting bigger constantly. Historically, we've just thrown more data into the pile, tried training for a lot longer, and hoped something smarter came out. There's now effort being put in to try and change how we think about the data going into models. Instead of training models on all of this data that we've collected, what if we create data specifically for them? What if we looked at the outputs that people liked when they ask questions and we train on that? What if we generate fake agent runs so that we can have tool calling as some of the stuff in our training data that we use for training these models? What if you had a ton of inputs and outputs for a given model that you could use to retrain a new, smaller, cheaper, faster model? More and more of the data that we're using is programmatically or artificially generated, and a lot of that data is allowing for us to make faster, smaller models. For example, GPT-5 is very clearly trained on a lot of outputs that were created by O3, which is why there's a lot of similarity between those models, but GPT-5 is much cheaper, faster, and overall quite a bit better. I also think this is why models have been popping up in our IDEs that are really good. Like in Cursor in the new agent mode, they introduced Composer 1. Composer is their model that, as far as I understand, is being trained on data that they have as a result of people using Cursor. If you use models like Claude or GPT-5, there is a quality of response that you do or don't bother editing with. And if you don't have the privacy mode on in Cursor, that's data that they have. As far as I understand, they're not using that data to steal your services or your code or whatever, but they're absolutely going to use it to make their models better. And I don't have any inside info here. It's my honest understanding that, just as a guess and from the little conversations I've had and blog posts I've read, that Composer is being tuned and trained on the inputs and outputs that users who are volunteering their data to Cursor have generated for them, which allows them to look at the best results from other models to make a better, smaller, faster model, which is why Composer 1 flies in comparison with other things. I also suspect this is how the new model inside of Windsurf works. The Windsurf model doesn't feel quite as smart as Composer, but it's surprisingly good, and it's even faster. It's like 2000 TPS. These models are trained on data from successful runs, which allows them to be better. It also allows them to do formats that are more complex, because otherwise you'd need a much bigger model to have 5 chained tool calls work properly. They're just collecting those tool calls and putting them back in as training data. Makes a ton of sense. So, quick recap. These companies have legacy data. Apple doesn't have any data. The way we're training models is shifting away from trying to train them on existing data from the internet and other sources, and towards trying to train them based on successful runs with previous models, using really smart, heavy, giant models to create data for smaller training runs, and just collecting and carefully curating all of the data that you need. There's even companies that are selling curated data that they pay to have made by humans and then labeled to companies. I've invested in companies that are purely doing fake projects for developers to build, like actual employed devs to work on side projects that will never ship, so they can curate, label, and then sell that data to other labs. So wild, so cool. And it's a big part of why these models are getting smarter and better at code and tool calling and all of that. So where the freaking hell does Apple fit in here? They're just not on the board. Companies like Cursor and Windsurf have a ton of data going in and out and through these models, which they can use for collecting and eventually training their own. Companies like Microsoft also have a ton of inference going on their platforms, be it through Copilot the website, Copilot on Windows, or Copilot in your editor. They can use that to reinforce, fine-tune, and train their own things. Google has infinite data. They can do whatever the hell they want. Meta's recently changed policy internally where before they could only use Llama models. Now they're letting employees use other models too, and that's going to be a source of some really good data as well. And then obviously Anthropic and OpenAI have enough usage all over the world to collect tons of data. This is actually a thing that Anthropic is so sensitive about, that they are known for cutting different tools out of access to their models. They previously cut Windsurf off, not allowing them to use their model for the things that they were building. They also cut off OpenAI, thinking and accusing OpenAI of using outputs from Anthropic models to train OpenAI models, when in reality, they were just using it for benchmarks, as far as OpenAI has said. I can't know for sure, but I'd believe it either way. Anthropic just cut off Trey, which is by the TikTok team. It's another AI IDE. I did a video that went really viral on it forever ago. I find it to not be particularly good for agentic work, and they've given it way too many tools, and the result is chaos. But they were building really heavily around Claude 4 and 4.5, and they had their access hard cut off from those models. And I get why. Trey is owned by TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, which is owned by China, and they don't want Chinese companies to have infinite access to all of this data. But that's all because they know that the inputs and outputs of 4.5 Sonnet are as valuable as 4.5 Sonnet itself at a certain amount, because you can use that data to create your own similar model. Yeah. Anthropic's now cut off a lot of companies. I have a whole separate video about that I'm planning on filming soon. But man, the need for this data is crazy. But if you know anything about these companies, you know that one of them is kind of willing to sell to whoever for the right price. Like, they don't really think about this. They just kind of do it. And that's Google. Google moved their main entity to a parent company called Alphabet. And part of the transition was so they could drop their whole "don't be evil" slogan. And since then, Google's willingness to collaborate with whoever, even competitors, in order to make some money and keep their competitors away, it's very consistent, at least. And I'm sure that Google offered the $1 billion deal here to prevent Anthropic and OpenAI from getting it. If we were to think about this as a who competes with who thing, the classic, most well-known rivalry in all of tech history was Microsoft versus Apple. Remember the good old Mac versus PC commercials? Yeah. Microsoft's no longer thinking about Apple as their competitor. Microsoft and Google are neck and neck, battling constantly. It is very rare these two companies get along for any amount of time for any real reasons. They don't like each other right now, especially. Arguably, Amazon fits somewhere in here, but Amazon's kind of like so deep on their own plane that everybody's kind of given up competing with them. Amazon and Google were fighting back and forth for a while, but now they just kind of feel like they're in their own worlds. I still remember the days where Amazon blocked Google from selling Chromecasts because they saw it as competitive with Fire TV, which, in my opinion, probably should have been a lawsuit. Oh, God. Good old anti-competitive Amazon. But the one company here that is thinking the most about this, but also cares the least, is Google. And they kind of view every single one of these companies as competitors. So what do we do about that? You rank them. So if we have all these companies that Google thinks they're competing with at any given time, how do they think about where they rank? I would argue that up until recently, Meta was their biggest competitor because Google makes their money on ads, Meta makes their money on ads. These are the two companies with the biggest and most successful ad networks in all of history. They are battling constantly for that. So where do the rest fit relative to Meta? OpenAI is a very interesting one. I would say OpenAI and Meta are probably on similar levels for Google. They're not as immediately detractive to the way Google makes money, but they're absolutely detractive to Google's long-term, like Google.com, Google AI models, Google infrastructure, all those things. But I would argue right now they're slightly below, which obviously means Anthropic is far below. Amazon is a weird one now. I'd put Amazon... where would I put Amazon? How does Google think about Amazon right now? I honestly don't know. These two just don't seem to think about each other a whole lot anymore. So I'll put Amazon relatively low, slightly above Anthropic. Google acts like Anthropic's real competition, so I'll put Anthropic higher. I say Amazon isn't because I've used Google Cloud. Google's not treating Amazon competition seriously. Microsoft, however, is a fun one. Google and Microsoft are definitely thinking way too much about each other right now. I'd say Microsoft is seen as a slightly higher competitor. But now, where does Apple go? Bottom of the list. Google doesn't really have any reason Apple winning hurts them. Apple being more successful doesn't really hurt Google because iPhone users make Google more money than Android users do. Apple's success does not really detract from Google in any way that they care about right now. So they're happy to partner. But when Google looks at the rest of the companies in this list, they're a lot more scared of them. In particular, with the AI stuff, these three in the middle here, Meta, OpenAI, and Anthropic. And if Google can eat some cost with some model training, a thing they're already really good at, and they can make a fine tune for Apple, hand them the weights, and reduce the likelihood that Meta, OpenAI, or Anthropic get any benefit from iPhone users, they're happy to do that. I might take back what I just said about Amazon not really thinking about competitors. Apparently, they just sent a legal threat to Perplexity because their AI browser, similar to the one OpenAI just released, theirs is called Comet. Apparently, Comet can be used on Amazon, and they don't like that, and they are now hitting them up. There's a blog post, Bullying is Not Innovation, on the Perplexity blog. Very interesting stuff. I'll be looking into that more later. So, yeah. Google working with Apple makes it less likely these three companies in the middle here can win Apple as a customer. They're willing to eat the cost and also give the weights to Apple, which is a thing I'm sure Apple wants. They don't want to have Google receiving the inputs and outputs from their users. Apple just does not operate that way. Fun fact that not many know, this is getting in a weird tangent. I'm so sorry, but once we're in the Google Apple stuff, I can't help myself. This is a particular special interest of mine. There is a protocol called RCS. It's a rich text format for sending text messages, an alternative to SMS. Google has historically been a big proponent of RCS because Google wants texts to be better, so they have an actual way to compete with iMessage. Apple seems to be a detractor of RCS because they want blue bubbles. They want iOS messaging to be best with iMessage and to make the Android users feel bad. That's at least what we're told to think. And eventually, Apple was forced by the courts to support RCS. Kind of. There's an interesting catch with RCS. RCS stands for Rich Communication Services. It's an open standard that anyone can choose to support. There is something missing from the standard, though. It does not include encryption. The RCS standard is an unencrypted standard, which means any texts you send through RCS were unencrypted. Google doesn't want its users sending unencrypted messages through whatever layers of different ISPs, CDNs, sketchy routers with hacks and things like that on it. So what did Google do? Google added encryption to RCS, exclusively through Google servers. The only way you could encrypt an RCS message was to first send the unencrypted one to Google, who would send you back the encrypted payload that you could then send to the user of your choice. So if Apple wanted encryption for RCS, Apple would have to send every one of your texts to Google first. Apple did not want that, so they did what they usually do. They quietly updated the standard, made an open standard for RCS encryption, speedrun the process of getting it adopted, and then made an actual encryption standard for RCS that now works and is shipped and is how Apple can do safe texting through RCS. So the public opinion is Apple is evil and terrible for not supporting the open standard. Meanwhile, Google's literally ingesting as much unencrypted data as possible because it's Google, that's what they love, and Apple went and made the actual encrypted standard. Don't believe everything you read on Twitter, boys. Anyways, Google and Apple have a weird history of supporting each other and standards and fighting and optics and all of that shit, but I don't think they care as much nowadays. I honestly don't think Google and Apple see each other as competitors the same way they used to, especially right now. That said, I don't think Apple wants to send a bunch of their users' data over to Google for no good reason. This is why Apple wants to have the model itself, the weights that it can run on their own servers, especially because they can go spend a ton of money on servers and don't care. They can use them for a lot of different things. Once you have a lot of GPUs, you can render a lot of Minecraft and also run a lot of AI models. I also happen to know some weird things about Google models, in particular that a lot of them are run on CPUs, which is fun. So I would imagine that there's enough overlap between Google and Apple's current state of infrastructure that this partnership makes even more sense. So there is one remaining question. Once Apple has these models and has users sending things to them, are they going to collect that data? Are they going to use this in order to make up the data gap that currently exists between Apple and all of their competitors? Apple doesn't have enough data to train their own models right now, but if they get a good one from Google and they collect all of the inputs and outputs that users do, that should give them enough data to make something decent. Maybe something decent enough and small enough that it could reasonably run on your phone, because that is Apple's goal in the end. They want to have edge compute for AI. The most powerful computer the average American owns is their iPhone. It's more powerful than most of the computers that most people have because they upgrade their computers every 4 to 6 years. They upgrade their phone every 3 to 4. And the phones are also just so far ahead, especially pre-Apple Silicon. There are so many powerful computers in people's pockets that just aren't quite powerful enough to run these big models. But if we can squeeze the right behaviors into a small enough model, the quality of experience we could provide at the edge like that is really promising. And no one's delivered on this promise just yet. The model that Apple's buying from Google here is for their cloud, so they can run it on their end so that users can get better results when they let Siri go phone home quick and send a response. But Apple's also done some interesting things around how that data gets passed. Last year, Apple announced some of the research they were doing in security for private cloud compute. The concept of private cloud compute is a way to, at a system level, encrypt packets that are being passed around so that you can still generate a response without actually knowing the contents of the message. It's kind of crazy. I don't know how far along this stuff has gotten, but I know there was a lot of collaboration between Apple and other manufacturers of actual CPUs and with ARM and whatnot to try and find a way to do proper private cloud computing so a user could send data up to Apple's cloud and have it generate a good response without Apple ever actually knowing the contents of either the message or the response. This stuff's all in an early research phase. Apparently, this code went public 5 days ago, which is suspicious around the way these things are aligned. The first push here was in 2024 in October, so over a year ago. Then they did one 2025 4.11. What changed here? It's like a very general update. Of course, all their examples are in Swift. Quite a language. And then they just pushed another change a weekish ago. Very interesting. Very interesting. There's a lot of files in this one. Seems like Apple's going really hard on the private cloud compute stuff right now. Interesting timing when you consider the recent news that we're covering. Seems like there's something going on here. Also, fun internal things. Apple's had so many problems with the Siri team and the AI ML teams that internally the AI ML team has been branded as AI ML less. Aimless. Funny pun. Yeah. The AI stuff at Apple has been getting a lot of shit internally, so much so that a new person was just put in charge of Siri internally, Mike Rockwell. Yeah, he was the guy who did the Vision Pro. How we know Mike Rockwell is the fixer that Siri's been missing. Siri's under new leadership at Apple, with Mike Rockwell taking over and taking on managerial responsibility under Craig Federighi's oversight. I still think Craig probably should have been the new CEO. We'll see how that all goes. Apparently, Rockwell hasn't been shy about criticizing Siri, according to people familiar with the matter. For years, he's pitched to the senior vice president on ideas for overhauling the voice system to make it more personalized. He's also been advising the AI group in recent weeks, even before the management changes, and Giandrea long considered Rockwell a potential successor. Yeah. Apparently, this came because he really wanted Siri to be a good way to control the Vision Pro, and he got more and more frustrated with it as they were developing the Vision Pro. Makes sense. Yeah. He's expressed disappointment in the demonstrations the Siri team created to showcase how the voice assistant could control Vision Pro. Yep. Makes sense. And hopefully, this, combined with this insane Google partnership, might result in Siri not sucking. They did call out in this article that Apple does still hope to develop its own large-scale model, which I suspect they will hopefully get some data from, or at the very least, now that they have so much money and a decent model, they can just throw a ton of compute at it and generate a shitload of artificial data to use for training their own things. Okay, this seems to confirm that Apple does intend to run the model on the private cloud compute structure, which explains why it's suddenly getting so many updates. Interesting, yeah. It looks like they're going real hard on the private cloud compute thing. They might actually be the only private solution for doing cloud AI generation. They're very committed to the privacy thing. I am curious how they handle this going forward. I think I've said all I have to say on this one. Apple doesn't have a good model. None of the open models are good enough for them. Google is one of the few companies with a good enough model for them, and one of the only ones that would lower the price arbitrarily enough because they don't really see Apple as a competitor. I also suspect Google doesn't trust Apple's abilities to use the model to train something better, smarter, or cheaper. And they also don't see them as a company that would ever sell this model separately. Google and Apple's weird historical rivalry and partnership makes this a weird match that kind of works, and I suspect is also going to be a lever they can hold against other companies like Anthropic and OpenAI as they try to come up with their long-term vision for how they're going to deal with AI. Wild partnership. Never thought I'd see the day that Apple's buying Google's model so they can run it on their own private servers, but nothing makes sense anymore, so here we are. What do you guys think? Is this a cool, smart move by Apple, or is this them admitting defeat? Let me know what you think, and until next time, peace nerds.